This open?
Yeah, we're probably gonna have a couple more people trickle in. So what we did at our last meeting is we went over our draft goals and objectives once again, largely unchanged from last time. I'm gonna pull them up on the board. I want us to kind of run through and see if anything really jumps off the page that maybe we are uncomfortable with or don't want to forward onto the steering committee. But at the end of this meeting time, I do want us all to feel comfortable going forward and then recommend somebody to help talk about this on September 8th to the steering committee. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that up right now. The only real changes that we've created since the last meeting was to add an element on placemaking and heritage streets. So this is something that we discussed briefly, and I apologize because I ended up having a conversation with Mark Peterson shortly after the meeting as well. But we want to try and create a sense of place in our downtown historic districts that aren't just related to the architecture of the buildings that are contributing to the district. So that means things like maintaining paving stones, which is currently in the existing 2007 comprehensive plan. Hello, Aaron. As well as just creating elements that are going to be complementary to the fact that we have historic districts. One of the great things about the economic the increases in property values around historic districts that we could probably document in Winona is that there's a sense of place, and that's why people want to reinvest and have their businesses in these locations. So we want to try and tie that as much as possible. Our downtown and riverfront subcommittee has essentially the same language included as well. They really want to see something similar to that. So intentional placemaking. And then I fleshed out a little bit further at the end our demolition by neglect component. So the objectives did not change, but we fleshed it out with a couple more strategies here. Creating a clear process for determining neglect and directing properties through support programs. So this is largely based on other demolition by neglect processes. When we first brought this to City Council, we tried to go through the nuisance abatement process, and they thought that that was not satisfactorily supportive, and I agree with them. Codifying maintenance and demolition by neglect ordinance to be in concert with the Unified Development Code. So the Unified Development Code is our zoning code here in the city of Winona. We are trying to bring in other elements of building code and bring in other elements of heritage preservation so that they're reinforcing of each other. So that's not just based on heritage preservation goals, but also on the goals of other parts of the comprehensive plan. And then exploring creating incentives for older buildings. So exploring tax incentives, implementing the financial incentives, education and outreach plan. We've talked about incentives ad nauseum in this group. So I would anticipate that we want to continue to do so. And then maintaining an existing building stock survey, analyzing condition of eligible buildings. So going out, what are the actual strategies to do that? Updating the building stock survey regularly and developing the actual property survey system. So those are my recommendations. Those are really the only changes from last time we spoke. Is there anything concerning about what we've included here? Anything you'd like to see added to or changed or made more robust?
In going through it finally, carefully, more so than I have previous to the other meetings, full disclosure. I just had a couple of quick questions. Is this downtown and I don't know, riverfront community? The idea of historic signage, but is somebody dealing with public art conversation as well?
Yep. So actually when I said that they had essentially similar language in their section, they actually have a strategy for public art under a similar objective.
Okay.
So
there's some overlap at times, like the Princess Winona statue specifically I was thinking about.
And I'm happy to add public art here if we feel like that's important.
Feels like that those two should be working together, so and for consistency and all kinds of other reasons.
You know what I'm going to do? Look at this. I'm going to go steal this, incorporate public art into regular public infrastructure. I'm going to crib it right there. There you go.
You just make it all look so.
It's like Control-C, Control.
That's how he does it.
Any other comments?
And the term cultural landscapes, I am not a historic preservationist as by trade at all, but I don't know if the word cultural landscapes in this section about the increased ability of lesser known historic districts, that idea of the things we don't see that it's not architecture. I don't know that term anywhere.
Okay, so which goal is that? What page? Page 2?
Page 2, under goal, increase visibility of lesser known
Mhm.
historic sites, district sites and properties, maybe the term cultural landscapes gets
Okay.
added there. And
You want to, is it as an objective to develop cultural landscapes, or we want to increase the visibility of cultural landscapes like historic district sites and properties, or how do you want to kind of phrase that?
I don't really know, I just, the term popped to my mind, and because I'm not really a historic preservation, but people who do, SHPO people will talk about historic or cultural landscapes, and it's sort of acknowledging that there were things here that weren't necessarily built things, or maybe they were mounds, but they're not things that we see physical remnants of anymore, but they have cultural historic significance.
It's almost like an added,
Right.
Just another comma on cultural landscape. But that's how I see it, sites, cultural landscapes, just so it's.
Megan, from your perspective, since you are the expert here, do you want to, adding cultural landscapes here seem to make sense to you? Does that description jive with what Carrie was suggesting?
Yeah, I thought maybe it'd be helpful just to give a little context of what cultural landscape means. And I apologize, I couldn't hear, the microphone gets a little harder to hear down at the other end of the table, but just for everyone's own definition and thinking, cultural landscape refers to basically places, landscapes that have been modified or built that are considered to have historic significance. So it covers things like your public parks, cemeteries are a big one that falls into cultural landscapes, indigenous sites, basically natural landscapes that have been impacted or influenced by some sort of built environment, if you will. They've been planned in a way, and so that's what this word encompasses, is landscapes that have historic significance and oftentimes have, I'll say, a human touch on them, whether it's a public park or a indigenous culture or some place that we've modified over time. So that's what that term is intended to capture.
Perfect. All right, so I think including it here definitely is a good fit.
Thank you.
Carrie, do you want to keep rolling?
Those are, that's
it.
Well, one more other quick thing is I might just suggest, I know, and you just put them in IE example, the Dakota Unity Alliance, but I think it might be important that you don't have to change examples that you use, but I mean, to actually reach out to, the Prairie Island community and the Dakota nations.
Yes.
Reservations and the tribal they are organizations that have their cultural heritage here.
Yep. Perfect. Sorry, I just added tribal organizations. We'll zoom in really, really close on it. We're good.
just change out the glass.
Sorry. I shut the door though, so we can also yell in this room now. So everybody online can make sure that we can all hear.
There we go. Thank you.
Did anybody else happen to comb through this and have any changes that they want to add? Now's the time.
Luke, how many, the goals aren't numbered. How many goals total do we have?
You're right, they are not numbered, and forgive me for doing that. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 total goals.
Do we have any direction from the steering committee about how many total goals we should have?
We do not. These sections of the comprehensive plan will be as robust as they need to be or as narrow as they need to be.
I don't know if this is the time to discuss, Luke, or if this happens later in the meeting, but it did seem like some of the goals were related and could be combined into more succinct goals with objectives that satisfy more than one of these goals could be developed. So I don't know if we're doing that kind of work today, but there was a couple of them that I put in my notes as maybe could be combined in similar objectives for both.
No, I think that's valuable. And if you do want to tell us and we can talk through it, that'd be really helpful. The goal from the subcommittees is to get as much out as we can, and then we can pare down from there. So I'd rather end up with more than we need at this point and then move forward, paring it down with our consultant staff, including you, Megan, as well as our steering committee.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, Luke, is that happens later, not today.
Correct. We would be trying to do
Okay.
it after September 8th. So at the second meeting of the steering committee on September 29th, we're hoping to really get some feedback on what they think should be combined, basically. Yep.
Okay.
But your notes, if you want to send me your notes, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I can. I marked up my copy from the 16th that you had circulated, so I will send that over to you. It's obviously not going to have your highlights, but
That's okay. I'm going to remove my highlights anyway. I did that right now before we talked.
okay. Sounds good.
Any other thoughts, comments? Fiora?
Well, I think about the felt environment and it comes up, for instance, with the ERC topic in the city and versus what is progress and thinking about how you can retain a sense of community and what's important to people in neighborhoods and how you can preserve that in this town. And I know, it's a huge controversy with the ERC, but I don't think people are thinking of all the 5G that's going to be there available, for the children to be absorbing. And I don't think that people are thinking about the impact that you have of the crisis that you feel when you're next door to a fire department and a police station. And these children are going to be in that playground and they're going to be feeling, it's kind of like our society is already feared. There's such fear mongering every which direction that why put them in that place?
So we do have we knew that this is going to come up. We knew the comp plan process would include elements that are going to be very site specific. So we actually have a transformative project subcommittee that's fleshing out the individual details of that project in particular. What are the considerations that we actually have for that project in addition to 4 other projects? So they're going to have 1 to 4 pages per project in the comprehensive plan. Similarly, as we talk about built environment, we do have our land use subcommittee reaffirming the built environment of historic Winona. So going back to having a street grid that's going to be walkable, trying to have smaller lots with diverse ownership. Those types of elements are being reinforced in that subcommittee in particular. But I'm happy to include that here as well, if you want to. There's a consensus from this group.
I think that should be a consideration with all the things that we want to put in that are the best and the slickest new things.
Sure.
That there's algorithms that drive our society that we have to continue to look at. Does it really mean that life is going to be better if you think about it that way?
Sure. So I'm putting in reinvesting in Winona's traditional built environment and pattern. And then underneath that, something similar to, can you repeat what you just said? Sorry.
No. I can't.
It's more like balanced approaches to neighborhood development.
Well, here's an example I give to people. I lived in Northampton, Mass.
Mhm.
One day I go out and on the main street, the certain length of the street, you had to put in now your license plate number in order to put your quarter in to get some time on the meter. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm 1 second late, I have to give you $15. What if I'm in the town, I'm in a business, I decide to buy something else, I have a conversation with the neighbor, someone gets hurt and I help with that. It's just like, maybe it's gonna give you a little bit more money and it's more efficient, but is it really important to have that in place in a community where you want to build community?
Sure. So how are our systems reinforcing that community element?
Yes, it's not always about, oh, this seems to be the most efficient and the most cost effective.
Sure.
That isn't the standard that we should use for all the decisions we make in our community.
So I'm just trying to throw things at the wall that'll stick and look similar, sorry. For those of us here who might need to read from the back. All right, so reinforcing systems for community building. So I'm going to put down an example like using technology in a flexible way to support everyday interactions.
Or something.
I'm not quite seeing the connection here to the
Okay,
preservation.
yeah, so how can we tie it to preservation? So what's a good basis for that in preservation wise?
When I talk to people about, I'm on this little subcommittee and, what do you think? They have a really hard time figuring out how to express something about maintaining Winona, but seems to have to do with how they feel about Winona. It's not necessarily, it's like, you can introduce something, but it doesn't carry through the feeling that you get of a small town and a community.
Mhm. So there's a phrase that we sometimes use, and I think we're probably going to try and use in this overall comprehensive plan because of the push for our housing in particular in our community, is that no neighborhood should be, or no neighborhood should be exempt from change, but no neighborhood should experience large scale change, basically. So we're not looking to disrupt entire neighborhoods, or in your case, what you're trying to get at is the historic feeling, the heritage of Winona. One city, Bozeman, Montana, just kind of calls it the Bozeman feel. That's their entire comprehensive plan element, is it has to tie into the Bozeman feel. And we're trying to find the right language for that, right? And within a heritage context. So is there a heritage context that we can kind of tie that to?
So Luke, I'll just throw this out there. There's a concept in, I'll say, National Park Service and preservation world called historic integrity. And historic integrity is a word that they use to try to describe historic character. And there's 7 things that make up historic integrity. And in order for a historic district or a historic place to be designated as a historic place, it has to have historic significance, meaning it's important to our history, typically our American history if we're talking about the National Register, but it would be Winona history if we're talking about local designation. And then in addition to historic significance, it has to have historic integrity. And I think where you're going is trying to find a way of expressing historic integrity and retaining historic integrity. And integrity has 7 components to it, and these are defined by the National Park Service. One is materials, like physical materials. One is craftsmanship. One is, I'm going to get some of these wrong here because I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head, but the one that there's 2 that I want to bring up specifically because I think this is what was being alluded to earlier is association. There's a integrity of association, meaning it's somehow associated and feels like Winona. And there's another one called feeling, meaning it feels like Winona. And those are the sort of hardest to quantify when it comes to defining integrity. But those I think is maybe what's being hinted at is that feeling and association with historic Winona and how do you retain that? And then there's, of course, 3 more that I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now. I think mine might be workmanship.
I got it. Location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling and association.
Okay, there you go. So scratch off craftsmanship. I was substituting words there. That's just workmanship. And thank you to whoever just pulled that off the internet.
That's great. National Register 101.
So yeah, that sense of association, or that association and that sense of feeling is really kind of what you're getting at. I agree completely, Megan. Thank you for bringing that up. That is unbelievably helpful. Off of the top of my head, and we do have plenty of time here. We have 40 minutes to flesh this out if we really want to. So how do we get that in here?
Well,
Team.
I'm struggling because I feel like this is maybe like a summary of kind of the goal of all of this work.
Mhm.
So does it need to be specifically called out, or is it kind of just naturally going to happen with our intentions with all the other goals? But maybe I'm wrong.
That's a good question. So every single section of this comprehensive plan is going to have a large contextualization brief before the goals and objectives. So when we do talk about the actual final document, we haven't weighed in on that, obviously. It's going to be a lot of wordsmithing, frankly, a lot of different drafts on the internal side. But when we talk about that contextualization brief, it will include a lot of elements here. I will add, just to add my own perspective here, I think it's important to reinforce that type of built pattern in particular for Winona. I think back on, I think one of the best examples of critiquing suburban sprawl developments in particular was Virginia McAllister when she did a field guide to American houses and just said it's slug, it's low density and it is not guided growth basically. And so unguided growth. And I think that that's exactly what we're trying to maybe push against, is we're trying to push toward, what is the natural ecological expansion of Winona that doesn't end up looking like Lakeville or end up looking like some other community south of the South Metro or what have you. No offense to anybody who might live in Lakeville. I don't know where you live, Megan, but I'm assuming it's not.
I'm in Minneapolis, 1910 neighborhood.
Woo! Good.
Yeah. So Luke, to your point, and someone else's point just a moment ago, I think that this concept of historic character and historic integrity could actually be addressed in a lot of the objectives, because a lot of what I heard earlier, like, or a lot of what's already encompassed in the goals. So for example, identifying additional stories and communities and context for Winona, the reason you'd be doing that is because you would want to retain the historic character and integrity of those communities and those community stories in Winona. So those goals are already kind of embedding this idea of integrity and character. And similarly, everything from preventing demolition by neglect. The intent of that, of course, is to retain historic character. So I think this concept could just be addressed in each of, or in some of the goals throughout, if it's not a goal on its own.
How do we feel about that? Got a thumbs up?
I like that.
Okay. Yara, do you think that we can splice in some good language there and kind of meet your intention? You're smiling.
Well, I'm always overwhelmed when I come here. Everyone knows so much. I'm just kind of struggling to keep up with what it is that's being presented, but.
Okay, we can take our time. Okay. All right, so that's what I'm going to do is I'll include that there. And when we are wordsmithing and going crazy with this over the next few months, that's what we'll do from the staff side to make sure that everybody feels pretty confident about that. Because Megan, thank you very much for pointing that out, that yeah, it really is kind of already said without being said. So let's go ahead and say it.
Sure.
All right. Jacob, Sean, I haven't heard from either of you two yet. Anything you'd like to add?
I'm good right now.
And not on this topic. I'm still reviewing others.
Okay. Any other topics, Jacob, in your review?
Nothing that's risen to the point of changing or adding anything.
Okay. Anybody else? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Luke, I just wanted to throw out maybe a framework for how to think about the goals and objectives in terms of how we think about historic significance, sort of what we feel and navigate kind of on a daily basis, and then how that becomes codified in a plan, either at a local level or a federal level, because there's a sort of a natural progression going from, like someone mentioned earlier, that feeling and association of being in Winona and what it feels like to having a locally or nationally designated site, and then what do you do with that national designated site? So like as we're thinking about objectives and process, I'll just throw out kind of like big picture how we understand history and how we, I'll say, codify history into a plan. So this is a process that's laid out by the National Park Service and adopted and used by many communities when it comes to understanding their history, and then, like I said, moving it towards a written plan of action. So the first step is usually to understand the history that you have at hand, and that's called a context study. And you all talked about this the last time I joined you. There were some really good comments about, we have some context studies and some understanding of Winona, but we also have some areas of history that we might not understand yet or have enough scholarship to understand yet. And so that was formulated into one or two of the goals. So once you have those contexts and you already have a good set of context Winona, and we want to augment those, then you move from having a context usually to a survey process. And the intent of that survey process is to look around you at, I'll say, a windshield level and say, what's physically built in Winona that represents that story in some way. So if we're talking about, and I'm just going to use some random examples, if we're talking about post-World War II architecture in Winona, we would look around and say, well, which buildings do we have from the 1945 to 1970 period? And we would just do like a really big quick survey and just cursory, put a check next to the buildings that are from that period. Then the next step is all those checkmarked properties that relate to that specific story, in this case, post-World War II architecture, we would do a little bit more of a deep dive on those and decide which one of those properties are the best representation of Winona's post-World War II history. And then for those, we think about, well, should it be locally designated? Do we want to nominate it for the National Register? And that's like step 3 is sort of a deep dive on those specific properties. And then step 4 is, now that you have those designated properties, how do you use those to either interpret or educate or create streetscape signage, kind of that like implementation phase. So kind of big picture, that's how we move from how do I feel about being in Winona to how do I have like an actionable plan. And I think as you go through this, each of your goals is going to fall into kind of like different spaces along that timeline. And some of your goals are about understanding context, and some of your goals are about identifying properties, and some of your goals are on the other end of the spectrum, which is educating people who like physically use and work in and redevelop these buildings. So you have, what's really nice about all the goals that I've been hearing and listening to from the subcommittee is that you have goals that run the whole spectrum of that process, and that you can be focusing on sort of like in parallel over the next several years. When this comp plan runs its course, you have like different sort of spaces within that spectrum that you can be working in, and that's a nice way to put a plan together.
I feel like that was a very good compliment. Is that what I'm gathering at the end comment there?
Absolutely, Luke. This is a great start to a great plan.
Perfect. I appreciate that. That's really good to call out. I think that context is both something for this subcommittee, but also something that we're trying to get at overall with the comprehensive plan. Is it's really identifying what makes Winona Winona, and then re-legalizing it is the phrase that we keep using. Is why did we make all these things illegal? And we know the reasons why we made those things illegal is because everybody was doing it in the 20th century. But how do we make it easier to reinvest so that these new, in this case with heritage preservation, so these buildings and these built environment landscapes can have their next chapter and continue to tell our story and reinforce our identity.
We had a walk recently with Engage and Historic Comprehensive Subcommittee, correct? Or was it just open to the public? I can't remember what
it was. Open to the public. So there was a walk from Wyndham Park through downtown.
Have we seen any results or anything that came from that?
We just received general notes. They're pretty consistent with what we were already talking about.
Okay.
We received them internally for essentially changing language to reinforce them. So we used that similarly for that kind of streetscaping element with the downtown riverfront subcommittee. That's also coming back into you here.
Okay.
And those are those changes. Yep.
Okay.
And I remember explicitly on that walk, people going, how do we know that we're in a historic district? And the answer is we don't know that in Winona. We don't know why we're in a historic district, except the buildings are old, but all of our buildings are old anyway. So may as well make some changes there.
This might not be for this subcommittee, but I'm gonna throw it out there too. And I know Mark and I have talked about it over the years too, of new builds that have kind of some future historic significance. Like I know when we added on to the history center, we were incredibly intentional with our choice of architect and design to highlight the historic building we were adding on to, but also create a new space that would be significant in itself as well. So that design of that building was very intentional, down to the color of the glass and the window colonnade out front was related to a Watkins extract. So I don't know if that's something percolate here, or if that's for a different subcommittee of some sort of incentive. I don't know what that means, but some sort of standard for some new builds, and certainly in certain areas that aren't a square vinyl sided sliding window.
What?
thing.
We have no vinyl sided. What are you talking about?
Place, but to just kind of foster kind of that stewardship of if you're gonna build something new, to maybe look a little bit more intentionally at that design process.
I love that you're bringing that up, because this is something that we have explicitly called out in our land use subcommittee and in our housing subcommittee is our design standards. So our unified development code, when we adopted it in 2017, started moving more toward a form-based code. And we incorporated design standard elements in those. Those design standard elements only apply to buildings larger than 4 units in residential districts. and mixed use buildings in our downtown and neighborhood core and fringe elements. So we know that we want to expand those design standards to include more, and I think that reinforcing that from the heritage side so that it's consistent with heritage and complementary. So we've been using the phrase context sensitive oftentimes when we are talking about that. I think that's definitely worthy of including. I think that we can actually include it in another goal. If you don't mind
Yeah.
me just taking this as an idea to include in another goal.
Yeah.
Can we add the word encourage too?
Yes, we can. Reevaluate and encourage. If I could spell encourage.
Force.
Well,
Reevaluate.
yeah, I do. Actually.
Yeah, reevaluate can go in either direction. I like encourage.
So I think that we do have another goal that we could slip that under. I'll be sure to include that. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? All right, if there are no other thoughts, I'm going to kind of take what we just had and incorporate some new language into this. But before we dissolve this subcommittee, what I really want is somebody who's willing to be a vocal spokesperson for this subcommittee to our steering committee on September 8th and September 29th. Those meetings will be from 11 to 1 p.m. If you are worried about taking out 2 hours of your day over the lunch hour, we are going to have a 20-minute slot allocated for every subcommittee. So you could show up for your 20 minutes, talk to your heart's content, well, at least as much as you can in 20 minutes. And then we would move on to the other elements. That it will in no way be the last time we look at the goals, objectives, and strategies for heritage preservation, because there will be a first draft that comes out at the end of the year, then a second draft at the start of next year, and then a third draft after that. So nothing is final until this is an approved plan by the city council.
What kind of audience will be there?
The audience on the September 8th and September 29th meetings will be the steering committee. So that's 11 members. And those are, 12 members. And those 12 members are a fairly broad spectrum of our community. We have students there, we have younger representatives, we have people who have a development background, we have people with a banking background, we have people with successful businesses, entrepreneurship, and we have people with historic inclinations at heart as well. So it's a good group of people. We've been really impressed in working with them. Who feels that they can articulate what we have talked about in a quick manner, concise manner, and yet also be convincing? Aaron's already pointing at people because I think he's trying to not volunteer himself.
Right? Classic projection.
There's lots of laughter in the room.
Uncomfortable laughter.
Otherwise, I'm gonna fall and tell some people who's gonna show up.
Well, what's most advantageous? Is it someone from the Historic Preservation Commission?
I think that this group has strong people in it. There's a strong group of people. When I look around and I see somebody like Sean Byer, who's done these types of developments, when you speak to these types of projects and you speak to these types of regulations, I think that there's real power to that. Sean, you already unmuted to say no, I imagine.
Yeah, I unmuted. I don't know if I'll be speaking. Well, our former mayor, he's a good speaker. Where are we at on that?
I'm retired.
Our former mayor, who is the former head of the Historical Society, would also, of course.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
Retired.
As would our current director of our Historical Society.
I'm worried about.
Otherwise, Aaron is pretty good speaker, aren't you, Aaron?
Aaron Ho.
Otherwise, I do think both of our members here who are from the Heritage Preservation Commission would be excellent.
For sure.
Can we do it together?
I am more than willing to let both.
I think that it would be valuable to hear from other voices, but I would be willing to do it with Aaron.
All right, I'm gonna jot down both your names. We'll sort it out. How does that sound to the whole subcommittee? Perfect. All right. I want to thank you all for your time. It has been a tremendous, almost 3-month process. All of you have been great and so incredibly gracious as we went through some learning elements, and then we started to flesh this out over the last 4 meetings. It's been phenomenal to work with all of you. This will not be our last time that I reach out to you, though. We will need advocates for this plan, and we will need people who are willing to review the entire document as well. And we intend to invite all of our subcommittee members back after the first draft is ready to go, so that all of you can kind of see how the pieces are interplaying with each other and make sure that we're going to get desirable outcomes as a community for the comprehensive plan update.
I want to thank you, Luke. You've done a great job in moving this along and fast typer, I like that. Really, it's been a pleasure to work with you again, and I think you've done a great job. So
Mark.
thank you.
I think we're working with you as well.
Second motion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, fast.
Favor.
All right, I want to thank everybody once again, and I will be ending this meeting. Megan, marvelous to have you aboard, and I'm so happy to work with you again in the coming few months. Jacob, thank you for attending. I'm glad that we now have a photo of you.
Thanks.
Such a pleasant one too. I appreciate it.
It is a pleasure.
I may have screenshotted that photo and I'm gonna send it to him later.
Yeah,
That's how amazing I think that is.
thanks there, Sean.
All right, well, if there are no further closing thoughts, we'll end. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Megan.